Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, George Floyd, 1 year later. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff, and our guests are joining us remotely. Next week will mark the 1 year anniversary of George Floyd's murder on the streets of Minneapolis at the hands of the now convicted Derek Chauvin. Chauvin pressed his knee to Floyd's neck for nearly 10 minutes, snuffing out his last breath. Floyd's killing sparked a communal outrage and a nationwide racial reckoning, including street protests, police reform legislation, and hefty corporate donations to Black and brown organizations. Books about systemic racism and anti-racism sold millions of copies as the public conversation about race and racism intensified. But what, if anything, has really changed? Joining us remotely, Renee Graham, associate editor and columnist for the Boston Globe. Rahsaan Hall, director of the Racial Equity Program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Kim McLaren, professor and graduate program director of writing, literature, and publishing at Emerson College. And Philip Martin, senior investigative reporter for GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. Welcome to all of you. So I'm going to flip this script just a little bit and start with having each of you identify or expound on one thing that advanced. I'm not going to use the word change because that speaks to a wholesale change, and pretty much all of you have said you don't see that. So within that context, however, some things have adapted, moved, a little bit of an advancement, and I want you to speak about that a little bit, and then we'll get to why you think really there has not been wholesale change. So Renee, I note that you pointed to Merrick Garland, the new Attorney General, citing white supremacy in a way that had not been cited before by any other Attorney General. Do you see that as an advancement as a result of the George Floyd racial reckoning?
I certainly think it's important. I mean, you have to call a thing, and you can't keep sort of talking around the issue. The problem is white supremacy. So I think if anything is going to change, I'm not saying anything has, you have to at least start with identifying what the problem is. So I do think it's important that Merrick Garland has said that's been said by members of the Department of Homeland Security and talking about the domestic terrorist threat. I think it is important to say that, but then I think it's important to then act on it. It's not enough to say it, but I think it's important to act on it because that's not necessarily what this country does particularly well. But there is a symbol of progress, at least, that people are saying the term white supremacy.
So Black Lives Matter, some believe, Philip, has become more mainstream since the time of George Floyd's death because of those street protests that we talked about. And one thing you've noted is the rise of some new leadership as a result. Is that, in your mind, and a kind of advancement since Floyd's death?
Absolutely. I mean, you have in Dorchester, for example, a young woman named Carrie Mays, who emerged from this movement. You have Monica Cannon Grant, who has been around for a while, but basically has made a mark on the city of Boston in terms of asking questions and focusing new attention where perhaps that attention might have been ignored before. It's now in the spotlight. And there, of course, are also older leaders, people who've been around for a long time, but who are basically gaining a new voice, if you will, because they're being paid attention to.
And as for you, Rahsaan Hall, what about a general better understanding and at least discussion? I recognize action is the second part, but just a discussion about systemic racism. You know, we have a lot of conversations on this show about people not able to grasp that, but in the wake of Floyd's death, there seems to be more of an understanding of what that means.
I think Floyd's death and us being in the midst of a global pandemic where communities of color, and particularly Black communities, were hit the hardest, in the aftermath of the 1619 Project, opened up the conversation and discussion around systemic racism. And so when Black folks were taking to the streets protesting police violence, they weren't just protesting police violence, but they were also talking about the disparate COVID infection rates. They were talking about structural and institutional racism and white supremacy and how that impacted those COVID rates, as well as exacerbating the existing educational gaps and wealth gaps. You have groups like BECMA with Segun Idowu being out front saying the reason our communities are going to suffer more from this pandemic are because of generations of structural racism and denial and disenfranchisement. And so the policing protests were just kind of the tip of the iceberg of these larger structural issues that we were protesting.
So Kim, now you've been pretty strong about at the beginning of this, saying you didn't think that much would come of it. But one of the things that you acknowledge is that there at least is more open conversation, particularly on the part of white people, to deal with some of the real issues of what equity is all about, what systemic racism is all about, as Rasan has said. Is that, in your mind, at least an advancement since the wake of in the wake of George Floyd's death?
Yeah, I knew you saved me for last because I'm the least optimistic about real change coming from that, and I still am. But I do think that there has been movement. Well, let me put it this way: there's less room for denial among white people who consider themselves good white folks, right? Well-intentioned liberal folks. There's less room for denial about the reality of the things that we have been talking about for centuries, let alone, personally for decades, right? 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, there was still wiggle room for people to say, yeah, things are not bad, things aren't great, and now I think there's less room for denial. And that's important. The question, of course, is what comes from that. But, you can't drive through a good white neighborhood without seeing Black Lives Matter signs in the front yard still. My question is, who's going to be the first to take those signs down, and when. But so I do think there's progress, and there's other progress. The importance of progressive prosecutors. I mean, DAs, right? The understanding of state and local politics is being really vital. So I think there's definitely been advancement. But as you said, let's see what happens.
All right, now we're going to get to the part where you all get to share your disappointment or just anger about what has not moved in a significant way, as you would describe it. So Rasan Hall, you're talking about, in your words, a wasted opportunity to really get to some good police reform legislation. There was conversation about it. There was understanding that something needed to change, looking at what happened to George Floyd and in the subsequent incidents. But the actual legislation itself, you say, still falls far short.
Yeah, advocates were pushing for so many things, ranging from defunding of police to the elimination of qualified immunity to banning the use of chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact weapons. And the reform law here in Massachusetts touched some of that. But organizations like the ACLU and many others who were taking to the streets to demand far more reforms than what we saw, and in conversation with legislators and lawmakers to push as far as we could, were overcome by the power of police unions and their rhetoric and fear-mongering. The reductions to the police budget were limited to police overtime, but the reality is that the city is obligated to pay that overtime regardless of what the budget is. So that meant nothing when they cut the overtime budget. Reforms to qualified immunity, which is the legal doctrine which holds police accountable for violating people's civil rights, was barely touched in a way that there's questions as to how meaningful it would be, whereas a state like Colorado eliminated qualified immunity protections for law enforcement altogether. So when we think about these moments of opportunity for reform, we think about a pendulum where it swings one way, and on that upswing, we need to get as much as we possibly can, because we know on the back end, we're going to see regressive politics and policies, rather, that try to undo the very things that we're done. Just look at what we've seen in the aftermath of the Obama administration, the attempts to dismantle affordable health care. So that's what we're probably going to see in policing. So we still need to push, but those are some of the things that we didn't fully see come to fruition in that moment.
Now, Philip, you believe that the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, needed to have moved away from defund the police, because you thought as a way of expressing the reforms, of characterizing what reform was needed, that actually did not work out so well in terms, and may have impeded the progress that Rahsaan says should have happened.
Well, I think when Rahsaan talks about the pendulum swinging, I think that pendulum was helped by an unhelpful slogan. And the reason I think defund the police is problematic as a slogan is that it's, even though we realize it's nuance, and those who excogitated that notion, that idea, that slogan, are meant it to be nuanced, it's not taken as a nuanced slogan. It's taken it's in a profound way. And so while you might understand something, a slogan like what a difference a DA makes, that is clear, because you're able to basically work with that and to extrapolate from that. When you say defund the police, I'm not surprised that only 28% of Black Americans support that notion, because it's taken, like with many other Americans, as literal. And so when you say defund the police, I think it basically has a problematic impact. It's just not a good, if I were a marketer or PR person, I would say, no, there's no way I would go there, because there's no way of understanding that, unless, of course, you dig very deeply into what that means in terms of reform. So yes, I think it is not helpful, was not helpful, and has served basically as ammunition, if you will, for reactionary forces in the country. They would already find ways to attack the movement. There's no doubt about it. But I think this essentially gave them more ammunition. And I'm not surprised by that Ipsos poll released last week. Ipsos USA poll released that last week, showing only 28% of Black Americans support the notion of defund the police.
Okay, Kim, with regard to the Derek Chauvin conviction, there were many people who afterwards said they were relieved that it happened, of course, but look what it took for it to happen. And like you, felt like, okay, it's going to be taken as one thing, but it does not indicate a rethinking about what needs to happen with regard to police reform around these real issues about chokeholds, about immunity, as qualified immunity as has been raised here, and other issues that have repeatedly been raised by Black Lives Matter activists and others.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, first I want to say I respect my colleague, Philip Martin. I totally disagree with him about that. I don't think that the slogan was the issue, right? I mean, I don't want to go too far down that, but I think the slogan is not the issue. The majority of Americans support greater gun control, and yet we don't have gun control, right? So public opinion polls, right? Leadership happens from the front, not from the back, right? No great movement happens when the majority of people agree with it. And defund the police means exactly that, defund the police. I'm 100% in support of that because reform doesn't work. We've been trying to reform the police for decades, and this is where we are. So we need to defund. But setting that aside, I do think the Chauvin trial, I think the reason that the police turned on Chauvin was so that he would be convicted rather than policing would be convicted, right? And what we need is to convict the way we police people, especially people of color in this society. And ironically, the Chauvin trial allowed policing to get off scot-free because Chauvin was convicted. Now, he needed to be convicted, no question. He needed to go. But I think it was the only reason it happened, and the reason that his chief testified against him and so many others testified against him was precisely because they were worried that the larger issue would be examined. And this gave them some breathing room. And I agree with Rahsaan that we knew the pendulum was going to swing back, so we needed to push as far as we can. And without, especially qualified immunity, without the ending that, I don't know what happens.
Renee, how do we look at, since George Floyd's murder, all of the many, it's even hard to count, how many other incidents, not as horrible as George Floyd, because we witnessed that live, but there are many deaths of unarmed black people, not just black men, and we just keep counting them. They keep adding up. That's in the wake of his death. So what does that say about any movement toward understanding this is a real problem and it has not been solved?
Well, I think it just underlines the need for, and I'm using the term police reform, even though I agree with Kim, the police are beyond reform. There needs to be a radical rethinking of policing in this country, including the concept of defunding the police in the way that you funnel money to areas of the communities that can actually help people and not hurt them. You still have people who are dying. That hasn't changed. But what you also don't see is the kind of national outrage. I feel like people have kind of dropped back to where they were. What happened to George Floyd was so egregious, and we witnessed what happened to George Floyd, that there was sort of no way of getting around to saying that this was wrong. That's why so many police chiefs and commissioners around the country were so quick to run to the first open mic they saw and say, oh my God, this was wrong. He shouldn't have done that. That is not policing, because what he did was so egregious. I'm not seeing that same reaction with some of the other more recent killings we've seen, because I just don't think people see it the same way. I think there's still a tendency in this country for people to believe, well, if a police officer says, I felt my life was in danger, then he should have to do what he has to do. And, we can't judge the police because we're not in that position. So I think that's one of the big problems. The other problem is, and I was really dismayed a few weeks ago when Congressman James Clyburn from South Carolina said he is not willing to sacrifice the good on the altar of perfect, meaning I'm willing to compromise on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And if that means getting rid of qualified immunity, he's willing to do that. And I'm sure there are other Democrats who feel the same way. That's completely unacceptable. The bill, in a lot of ways, really hinges on eliminating qualified immunity. And I think what's really upsetting is the idea that these things happen, and then there's this feeling of, well, we'll just settle for what we can get. We've been settling in this country for centuries. When does that end? And when do people say, this is what we want and we have to get this? And we're not going to compromise, and we're not going to get half a bill. If this is the moment, if the pendulum is still in the right direction, then let's get what we can get out of that and make sure it's what really addresses the problem and not halfway accomplishes what we need.
So let me follow up with you, Renee, and ask about the Black Lives Matter sign, the explosion in reading on anti-racism and race and history and culture about African Americans, the corporations stepping forward with these hefty donations to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a mainstay in their organizations. How do you see that now a year later?
I see a lot of it as being really performative. I think there was a sense that we have to do something. So we're going to get rid of Aunt Jemima, and we're going to retire Uncle Ben, because we've just realized now that George Floyd's been murdered that these symbols might be offensive. Like, that kind of thing is really kind of, in my mind, useless. I mean, what did that really accomplish? Did that company do anything to change who's in its boardroom? Did they change the people who make the decisions? That's where the real work gets done. I think it's great when went and ran out and bought all these Black Lives Matter signs. And I really hope there were Black people who were capitalizing off of that. But I know, at least in the areas I'm in, I don't see as many signs up. Because for them, the moment has passed. They don't need to make that statement anymore. Meanwhile, the same issues that led to George Floyd's death, and the same issues, for that matter, that led to the disproportionate impact of the pandemic in communities of color, especially with Black people, are still going on. So, yeah, I wasn't terribly impressed by what they did last year, because this year proves there was really nothing behind it.
Same question to you, Philip. The signs, the reading, the donations.
I agree with Renee in this regard. I think that it's selective amnesia, and it's hardly surprising. I mean, when you have a situation just months ago, January 6th, where history is being rewritten, and now folks who beat up cops at the Capitol, invaded the Capitol, broke windows, are now being described as visitors. like any other visitor to the Capitol, and you have large portions of the United States believing that interpretation of reality, it's hardly surprising that they have selective amnesia about George Floyd's death and the other deaths that have occurred after George Floyd, and a whole rewrite of Breonna Taylor's situation. You have actually have a cop in Louisville writing a book with a whole different interpretation of what happened with Breonna Taylor and her murder. So it's hardly surprising. Now, at the same time, some of those Black Lives Matter signs remain. One of my colleagues, Marilyn Shearer, photographed a Black Lives Matter sign on a pier not far from her home in Rhode Island. And the reason I mention that is because reactionaries are now not simply looking at these Black Lives Matter signs. Some have actually taken them down, have attacked have attacked people, have assaulted people, have excoriated folks, and then people are trolling across the internet, where you actually have people calling Black Lives Matter a racist movement. So I'm hardly surprised that you have this reaction. It's the very pendulum that Rahsaan was talking about. Right now, I tend to think that pendulum, by the way, is in the middle. And it needs all the help it can get in terms of how we basically frame our discussion about moving forward.
All right, Kim.
Well, I think they said it all. I agree. I mean, you know, even in the real decision is not, the real test is not whether you have a Black Lives Matter sign or, you know, the appropriate books behind you, but what you do on the daily basis. And I can tell you, even in faculty meetings at my beloved Emerson College, right, when issues of you know, his entrenched discrimination and entrenched processes that, you know, give privilege to some and deprivilege others, who is bringing up those conversations? It's still the Black folks. It's not the white folks, right? So if you're not in your daily business, if you don't go to your work, your job site, and see the systems that keep it the way it is, and the boardrooms and your jobs, then I don't care how many yard signs you have. You are not being, you know, you're not dismantling white supremacy. So I agree, it's all performative. And the same with corporations. Some of those same corporations that donated money to Black and brown organizations donated money to the people who supported the January 6th insurrection, right? It's both sides of the mouse. So that's all performative, which is what we said a year ago. I said a year ago, we will see, right? You know, and I'm not impressed. So I'm not impressed by the yard signs or the donations. I want to see substantive change.
Rahsaan.
Yeah, I can't say much different than what everyone else has said. I want to believe in white folks who are reading these books and putting up these yard signs, but history tells me something different. I think what's really important, though, to Kim's point, and others have said this as well, is like, what are you putting on the line? What sacrifices are you making, particularly in light of the white backlash that is coming to this notion of the pendulum that we keep referencing? What are you doing to stop it from swinging all the way back? How are you engaging with lawmakers? How are you engaging your own corporation where you work and your family members? Showing up to the protests are all well and good, but what are you laying on the line? And I think, you know, to the extent that the Overton window or the window of discourse around race and racism in America has shifted, it's meaningless if it doesn't change the facts on the ground for Black folks.
What would you like to see happen that would be non-performative, Renee?
Well, I think it's been referenced. You know, let's see what's happening in the boardrooms. I want the notion that white people will be willing to be uncomfortable in doing this work. It can't, you know, the work can't stop to the point where you feel like, well, I don't feel like want to do that, or that doesn't make me feel good. That's not how anything gets done. So I think there needs to be that real step and that real effort. You know, you can't read your way out of this. You know, all those books that were on the bestseller list aren't on the bestseller list still. So at some point that ended as well. You have to just do the work. And I get emails from people all the time, from white people who say, well, I don't know what to do. or I didn't understand that this was going on. And I don't know how they didn't understand this was going on. And what you do is treat people like human beings, treat people like you want to be treated. It's not that complicated. But I think when people sit back and feel hamstrung, just like, oh my God, I feel overwhelmed, what can I possibly do? I almost find that very frustrating. There's a lot more you can do than put a yard sign out. You can look at who's on your school board. Look at the people who are running for office. There are things you can do, in your backyard other than put a sign there that can actually affect change.
Kim, do you think that we will move to some non-performative action? Because George Floyd is still very much a marker for a lot of people in this country.
Yeah, I think a friend of mine calls it the Great White Awakening. But it was a shock. But it is dishearteningly easy. I think Rashawn said that for this country to go back asleep. If there was an awakening, we so quickly fall back to sleep. You shouldn't ask me that question because I don't want to be I don't want to bring down the conversation. But I'm not optimistic about America. I'm not. I'm sorry to say that. If you study history, if you see the cycles of history, progress and backlash, progress and backlash, progress and backlash, it's hard to know. It's hard to see what would make this time different than any time before. It's still possible. I want to believe it's possible, but I don't see what would make it different.
All right. Well,
sorry.
Thank you. That's the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. Thanks to all of our guests, and thank you for joining us. Stay with us as we continue our conversation on Facebook and Twitter. Also, be sure to watch, listen, and visit us online at GBH and GBH News all next week for special coverage about the impact of George Floyd's death on our communities beginning Monday. We're on Facebook and Twitter with our post show, continuing our discussion on George Floyd 1 year later. Philip, I didn't give you a chance to answer that question about what non-performative action would get your attention at this point.
I think action that basically attacks systemic racism. I think we have to, there are certain things that are happening right now that you would call changes. But those changes haven't gone far enough. One change that's important is within journalism. You find more journalists within organizations systemically addressing the issue of police information, for example, and taking this information at face value. One thing that could happen, and it's happening to some degree, it is for reporters to take a police report, for example, like the one that was issued initially with the death of George Floyd, where it was ruled that he died from a medical emergency. And it actually gave credit to the police officers for responding to that emergency. Totally ridiculous. That level of obfuscation is being attacked by journalists around the country, those I've spoken with personally. And I see some organizations have basically adopted new rules in how you basically look at information provided by police and law enforcement officials. A lot of that is not new. There have always been some degree of skepticism, but there's rarely been a healthy degree of skepticism when it comes to police reports and how we interpret their interpretation of reality, putting it face forward as the facts, as opposed to a fact that should be deliberated on to see if, in fact, it meets the criteria for truth. We saw the lie in the context of D.J. Henry, his death in Easton, Massachusetts years ago. We see the lie perpetuated with George Floyd and other deaths that occurred since the death of George Floyd. And we see situations where the police unions, for example, 15 police unions around the country have come up with a new policy saying that asking other police officers to intervene if something bad happens. That's not enough because it's the failure there to see the systemic racial aspects of those situations in the first place. And police unions, I'm afraid, are part of the problem. And that's one of the things that has to be addressed. One change I would say, Callie, that's really important. I think it is very significant that large percentages of white Americans, brown Americans, Asian Americans are still on board this coalition. I think my colleagues are right in asking the question how one is on board. But I happen to think that it's not just performative. I think many people are in fact committed. How committed they are is a question. At the start of this thing, you had an ABC News poll that showed over 60% of Americans suddenly believing that there was this thing known as systemic racism and supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. This was an ABC poll taken in July of 2020. That number has receded fairly dramatically to hovering just above 50% right now, but still higher than it's ever been in terms of the way people look at systemic racism and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Okay. Rasan, how would you answer the same question?
Yeah, I think what I would see as non-performative is the elimination of qualified immunity, both at the state and local level, the banning of facial recognition technology by law enforcement, an unreliable and racist technology, substantial reductions in police budgets across the state, the decertification of at least a third of Massachusetts police force, given the misconduct that they've been engaged in. I think those are some concrete steps that I would want to see. I'd also like to see substantial investments at the federal, state, local, corporate and philanthropic levels investing into communities at the same time that there is a reduction in police budgets. Seeing white CEOs and executives step down so that people of color, particularly Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks, can ascend to some of those positions. I think those are the substantial concrete steps, a rebuke and pushback of the effort to minimize or vilify critical race theory. This is something that is being used to cast a different light on the narrative of American exceptionalism and bring truth to the light of this nation's history and original sins of genocide and slavery. Those are the meaningful steps that need to take place in this country.
Right.
So,
can I jump in on that?
Oh, sure.
Briefly, just because I agree with Rashawn, and he brought up critical race theory, and I'm glad. Part of critical race theory says that Black people only make progress in this country when it coincides with white self-interest. And I think that is the real change we need to see, is that white Americans those people with the yard signs, need to understand that dismantling white supremacy is not something they need to do just for us, although obviously we bear the brunt of it. But until they understand that it is in their interest, that they have to take ownership of it and understand that it affects them too. Obviously, it affects us more. But that until they dismantle white supremacy in self-interest, then the progress is going to be limited, right? Because pity and charity only go so far, as we see, right? People are only willing to step outside and cost them, pay the price, as Rashawn says. But until they understand that, yes, you will lose something from dismantling white supremacy, but you will gain something, which is this country that you pretended to have lived in, for the past 200 years, you could possibly really create that country. But until that happens, I'm not sure, but that's what needs to happen.
Well, just so all of our viewers can understand, what do you see as their self-interest? What would you say is their self-interest, which then is what they should be attending to, in addition to concern about what's our bearing the brunt of it, as you said?
Well, there's a great book out now, the Some of Us, I think it's Heather McKee, I think that's her name, which goes into this really brilliantly, which makes the point that, white supremacy benefits white people for sure, but it also costs. The reason we don't have universal health care, the reason we don't have better schools, the reason we spend so much money on policing. We're like, our police budget national federally is like the third biggest army in the world, right? Like the reason that we spend all this money and our infrastructure is crumbling and all this kind of stuff, that's all intertwined with white supremacy. So if you are a mediocre white man, you might not get that job that you didn't deserve, but you have better schools, better bridges, better living, better health care, right? That's what I mean about it will cost. There is a price, but you're paying a price that you don't see. Everybody pays a price for white supremacy in this society, and having a society that is not what it could be and should be.
Would you repeat the name of the book? Because I missed that.
I think it's called The Sum of Us.
Okay. Somebody else wanted to add something?
Yeah, just quickly. There was a recent article.
Renee and...
Yeah. I mean, I was just going to say that there was an article I think it was in the Globe recently that talked about closing the racial wealth gap would increase the economy by, I think, $2.5 billion. So that's in white folks' interest.
Okay, got you. Renee.
I just wanted to say there's also an anecdote in that book that Kim mentioned about, and I think it's Alabama, this was years ago, where a court order said the public pool had to integrate. But instead of doing that, they closed the pool to everyone. Now that is a sort of an example of how white supremacy affects white people. So the idea that, well, we don't want these black people in the pool, so you don't get to go to the pool either. Like, that's the absurdity, that's the sort of insanity of white supremacy. And so if you sell that to people and let them understand that this is affecting you in ways that you don't understand. A few weeks ago, there was a young white man, I believe in Maryland, who was shot by police. It was almost like a Tamir Rice situation where he was playing with a toy gun. And the police showed up and he was shot once. And then when he went down, the officer shot him a second time. That got no attention whatsoever. I remember thinking, why don't white people understand this? That even though police disproportionately kill people of color, they kill a lot of white people in this country too. And they have to understand that when you talk about changing policing in this country, that will benefit them and that will benefit their children as well. So, I mean, that's really the idea. It's like, you're not just doing this sort of charitable thing for black people. Look at it as something you're doing for yourself.
Well, that is reminiscent of the case that has just come to light because the video has just been released of the white woman with dementia who accidentally, she didn't know what she was doing, so she took some flowers from a flower store, like a Walmart, I think it was, and then they stopped her. She returned the flowers. Now she's walking home alone, and Walmart called the police. The police arrived. 2 people. This is one woman. She was 70 years old or 80 years old, I'm not sure, with dementia. They asked her a question which she clearly could not follow. They wrestled her to the ground, broke her arm, pulled her shoulder socket out, handcuffed her. This is all on body cam. Then took her to the police station where she is saying, "I am in pain," and they left her there for 6 hours. While they, on the cop video, the surveillance video inside, said to themselves, "I love this." And the other one said, "Oh yeah, I like it too." That's all captured on tape. The daughter is, of course, filing a lawsuit, and they've had some response to it. But normally that would have been a black person given the history. But this is a older white woman alone who maybe weighed, and 2 very healthy younger people wrestling her to the ground. She didn't have any weapon.
This is the basis of black feminism, right? The Combahee River Collective statement that said if black women were free, it would have to mean that everybody else were free, because all systems of oppression and discrimination would have to been dismantled. And if you can get white folks to understand that, like if we are actually free, y'all will be more free. Right? Right. So you should work for our liberation for your own good as well as ours. Right. And it's only until
that statement is more than 40 years old, and it's still true today. So I thank you, Kim, for bringing that up.
Well, anecdotally, I'll just mention one of the first stories I ever did as an intern reporter was talking to a white homeowner in South Boston who was moving to one of the suburbs and was selling her home for almost nothing. This is around 1979, 80, selling her home for almost nothing. And the reason she was because black people were moving into the neighborhood, she was told, by some of the South Boston marshals. She ended up selling her home for pennies, and the person who benefited, by the way, was associated with the South Boston marshals. That's how racism hurts white people. I mean, selling your home for a penny because you fear that black people are eventually moving into the neighborhood.
Right.
Extraordinary, stark example.
Correction, the woman was 73 years old. She weighed 80 pounds, just to be clear. So when two young people wrestled her to the ground, she weighed 80 pounds. Anyway, I have a question to just bring this to conclusion of a sort, and that is this. We look at pivotal moments in history, usually years later, with the benefit of history, to actually put them in the context of where they are, or on the spectrum, of where they are in history. I know it's early. None of us are historians here. But how do you see the George Floyd, anniversary? I'm looking at his death. We've marked that now 1 year. How will this fit in the spectrum of, racial discussion, not progress? I don't know even how to phrase it.
I would compare it in many ways to the watershed moment represented by the O.J. Simpson verdict. And the reason, the reason I think it's that huge is because it sparked a movement. We're not talking about a movement just locally or just in the United States. But the fact that you have the images of George Floyd on walls in Ramada and the Palestinian territory, in Gaza, the fact that you can walk past a George Floyd sign in Johannesburg, and for that matter, in Tokyo, in parts of Roppongi, in Tokyo, an area of Tokyo. The fact that in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, you had George Floyd being evoked at demonstrations by workers. It shows that, and of course, George Floyd is just a symbol. They're talking about something that happened in the United States, but something that's also impacting them in terms of race, ethnicity, class, and caste in their respective countries. So it sparked a movement. You juxtapose that with the movement that began with the killing in Florida years earlier of a young man, Martin. I'm forgetting his name.
Trayvon Martin.
Trayvon Martin, of course. Which that combined with the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson helped spark the Black Lives Matter movement. First as a slogan, a hashtag, and then as something that was far more comprehensive and widespread. And so it is a watershed moment, the killing of George Floyd, the anniversary, and the movement that sprang from it, which was really a resurgent movement of Black Lives Matter, but far more powerful than that which began years earlier. It's precedent.
Rasan, how do you see it?
I see it as akin to the tail end of the civil rights era and the uprisings and the rebellions that we saw through urban centers in LA and Newark and Detroit, right? Those were in response to the conditions, the intolerable contingent conditions that existed in those communities that was precipitated by the spark of police violence. And so I think we see this at the front end of the racial justice era or the racial justice movement, but it will be remembered as a series of protests and uprisings in community. But how is it going to be any different from our reflection on those uprisings and rebellions in the late 60s compared to what we're seeing now? We had high water marks in the late 60s when Black folks were getting killed by the police and folks were rebelling against that. We had a high water mark when Rodney King was beaten to a pulp on video, and then the officers were acquitted for that. How did that change things? And now we're at another high water mark, and 20 years from now, we're going to be looking at this saying, how have things changed?
Kim?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I was going to bring up Rodney King because that's precisely right. And I appreciate Philip's point about the internationality of it. And I think in some ways it might have a greater lasting impact on other oppressed communities outside the United States than it potentially does here. But I agree with Rashawn too, that for me, the question is, it could be seen as the turning point, as the point when America finally woke up. But it also, I hope that it would be seen as that and decided to do right, as they used to say, do right. But I fear it will be seen as our last opportunity and one that we squandered. That this is the last chance to finally acknowledge the truth of racism and white supremacy, and that we've squandered it, and that there will be no return. So I have a hope and a fear.
Renee?
You know, I think it's the same thing. I think that urgency level we saw last summer, it has dissipated. And I think things are different. We also know in this country that when it comes to Black people, where there's an action, there's a white reaction. And I think we're seeing that in lots of ways. You know, the insurrection I saw very much as almost being like a kind of anti-George Floyd protest against what people were trying to achieve. And I'm also about to make a terrible comparison, so I'll apologize in advance for it. What this period kind of reminds me of is how at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone ran out and bought puppies. Everyone wanted a dog. Now we're seeing a year later, as things are opening up and people are getting back to their lives, the shelters are filling up again. Because people really didn't have the stomach to be dog owners and realize what a piece of work it can be, even though it's very gratifying, when you have a dog. That's where I kind of feel things are. Like, it has this moment, but how do you capture it? How do you keep the momentum going? And I think that's the real challenge going forward.
Can I just mention one other thing? I'm so sorry. I meant to compare, the comparison I meant to is in fact to Rodney King verdict, not the O.J. Simpson verdict, in terms of watershed moment. Those things are very different. And I'll just add one other thing. One reason why this movement also has taken on greater significance and why it may be sustained to some degree is precisely because of self-interest of white Americans and other Americans, in the sense that we're not just talking about Black Lives Matter at this point. There's also a feeling that we are on a precipice of losing democracy. And that insurrection that we saw on January 6th, that reactionary incident we saw on January 6th, that, as Renee said, is a backlash, without question, in many ways, to Black Lives Matter and to the effort by Black and brown people to vote in this country that culminated in the new administration in November. But it's also a situation we're seeing those who back democracy with capital D, and those basically who are militating against it by embracing authoritarianism. That's also where we are at this moment.
Okay. Well, that's where we're going to have to leave it right now. So I thank you all for joining me in this very important conversation, marking this incredibly important watershed moment. Thank you.